The Pacific, 1944. The first thing the Marines remembered about Peleliu was the sound. Most people imagine the Pacific War as jungle, palms, mosquitoes, and rifle shots. They imagine long pauses and sudden ambushes. They imagine the scrape of boots on coral sand and the slow, careful push forward. They imagine infantry against infantry. But the men who were actually there almost never talk about rifles first. They talk about the heavy guns. They talk about the guns that made the air itself feel solid. On Peleliu, a scorched, razor-sharp coral island held by Japanese forces inland, the Marines were introduced to the sound that would define the next 3 hours of their life. The deep, concussive, hammer-like whump of the .50 caliber Browning M2. It was not a rattle, not a chatter, not the aggressive drill bit ripping scream that would define the German MG42 over in Europe. The Browning made a slow, authoritative heavyweight punch. Each individual round seemed to exist. I could feel each discrete impact like someone pounding a telephone pole into concrete with a steel driver. Marines who fired it, or were simply near it, described the entire ground under their boots, vibrating like a struck drumhead. This sound, this rhythm, this pace would become the signature of the weapon. 550 rounds per minute. Half the cyclic rate of the German MG42. Yet here, on the coral ridges and honeycomb of caves in the Pacific, the US, 50 calories was not merely a weapon. It was an instrument of terrain domination. Not suppression in the modern doctrinal sense, but actual physical, structural denial of any forward Japanese movement. The M2 was heavy, yes. The tripod was heavy, yes. The carrier with ammo belts weighed more than most men wanted to carry. But once set, once locked in, once elements of 1st Marine Division pushed inland, the M2 was the anchor around which entire local fights would pivot. And this chapter begins here because the Pacific, more than in Europe, revealed the central truth that often gets lost when comparing guns by cyclic rate alone. The M2 was not built to win a rate of fire race. It was built to win the war of effect. On the 15th of September 1944, as the first waves of Marines pushed through the beach landing zones, they encountered Japanese defensive architecture that was designed to punish infantry. Interlocking fire, pre-sighted kill zones, and caves blasted directly into the island's ridges. It was a defensive scheme meant to force Marines into predictable lanes of advance, where machine guns, mortars, and small arms could cut them down. The Japanese had their own heavy machine guns, the Type 92, a 7.7mm weapon that had a relatively slow rate of fire and was accurate and durable. But it was a weapon intended mainly for infantry engagement. The M2 was something different entirely. 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds, traveling at over 2,900 feet per second, could rip through rock, coral, timber, light armor, and aircraft skin. It was not merely an anti-personnel weapon, it was a multi-role heavy machine gun, anti-materiel, anti-aircraft, anti-vehicle, and anti-personnel. At Peleliu, it did something the Marines would never forget. It collapsed caves. Fired in long enough bursts, an M2 could literally erode the front lip of a cave opening, pulverizing the coral limestone into powder, denying the Japanese the very architecture they depended on. Where the MG42 was about overwhelming incoming infantry with a storm of bullets, the Browning M2 was about reshaping the actual surface of the battlefield. That is a foundational difference, and it is why strategically the M2 would end up being the weapon system with the longer legacy and deeper impact. People often compare guns as if they are in the same category, MG42 versus BAR. MG34 versus M1919, MG42 versus M2. It is tempting, because the numbers are attractive. 1,200 revolutions per minute versus 550 revolutions per minute. Double the rate of fire must be superior, but on a real battlefield on Peleliu, on Saipan, on Tinian, the number of bullets per minute was not the decisive metric. The metric that mattered was what each bullet could do. When a Navy Seabee or Marine Armour Support crew brought a Browning M2 to bear on a reinforced cave position, the difference was not academic. It was visible. The rounds punched baseball-sized holes in rock. They could ricochet inside a confined space with catastrophic effect. They could disable Japanese machine gun positions through sheer kinetic force. The MG42, on the other hand, in its intended context, was optimized to sweep open ground and pin infantry down in Europe's more horizontal battlefields. In the Pacific, the key was not sweeping fire. It was penetration. This documentary series eventually concludes that the M2 won. Not because it was lighter, not because it was easier to carry, not because it was more ergonomic. It won because, in the true meaning of defeating a battlefield problem, it was the weapon that solved the largest number of combat challenges across the most theatres. It could kill aircraft. It could kill boats. It could kill light armour. It could kill fortified positions. It could kill trucks, landing craft, and engine blocks. The MG42, by contrast, was a phenomenal anti-personnel system, arguably the best ever built for that role, but it was limited in what problems it solved. The M2 solved nearly everything. That is the strategic frame this entire documentary is built on. Historical accounts from Peleliu repeatedly emphasize that when the M2 began firing, Marines actually felt a sense of relief, because when an M2 was on the field, Marines were not just infantry anymore. They were a combined arms unit in micro. They had engineering-level destructive capacity at the level of a unit the size of a squad or section. They had a weapon that could force the Japanese to retreat into tunnels, to close openings, to reposition, to shift their tactic from aggressive counterattacks to more passive, bunker-bound stalling. The M2 changed Japanese battlefield behavior, and that is the measure of a winning weapon system, a weapon that changes enemy decision-making. This is another key documentary concept. The M2 was not just a gun, it was an ecosystem. The tripod, the cradle, the aircraft mount, the AA sight, the vehicle pintle, the ammunition belts, the logistics behind it. And because of this ecosystem, the M2 could be mounted on ships, jeeps, half-tracks, tanks, landing, craft aircraft. This was not a machine gun. This was a distributed firepower platform. The MG42 was extraordinary, but it was fundamentally a crew-served infantry support weapon. The M2 was a strategic asset. On Peleliu, once the beachhead was stabilized and the advance began toward Hill 100 and the Umabrogol ridges, Marines began to systematically identify fire pockets and methodically collapse them with combined arms. Flamethrowers, satchel charges, grenades, M2 heavy machine gun fire. The M2 was not the fastest, and it was not the newest, but on that day, on that island, it was the most consequential, because while the MG42 was terrifying, the M2 was authoritative. This is the thesis that frames the rest of the series. The first thing any Allied soldier learned about the Gothic Line in 1944 was that mountains did not fight themselves. The ridges, cliffs, and rocky outcroppings of central Italy formed natural defensive bastions, but without men, without weapons, the peaks were inert. What made these positions deadly was the soldiers who manned them, and the MG42, the Hitler's buzzsaw, was their heartbeat. High above the valleys and olive groves, German crews moved with practiced precision, lugging the stamped steel barrels, tripods, and belt boxes of the MG42 into pre-selected positions. Every crew had a mission: cover the approaches, hold the ridge, and deny the Allies any foothold on the slope. The MG42 was not merely a tool of war, it was a force multiplier. One gun, one emplacement, could dominate an entire valley if used properly. The MG42's design was simple in its intent, lethal in its execution. A belt-fed, air-cooled machine gun capable of firing up to 1,200 rounds per minute, it was engineered for sustained fire and rapid barrel changes. In the mountains, this meant German crews could keep a continuous wall of fire sweeping the approaches, forcing attacking infantry to hug the terrain, slow their advance, and expend their own ammunition just to survive the march uphill. As dawn broke over the Apennine ridgelines, a platoon of German MG42 crews had already occupied 3 pre-prepared positions. One sat in a partially collapsed farmhouse overlooking a narrow mountain road. Another was tucked into a rocky ledge beside a thin ridge that funneled attackers into the kill zone. A third occupied the remnants of a small village, its roof partially caved in but its walls reinforced to withstand artillery fragments. Each crew was composed of 3 men: the gunner, the assistant gunner, and the ammunition bearer. The gunner operated the weapon and maintained accuracy on moving targets. The assistant gunner prepared belts, swapped barrels, and adjusted the tripod's elevation. The ammunition bearer ensured that rounds flowed uninterrupted, a continuous stream of 7.92 millimeters, Mauser cartridges destined to meet any approaching Allied infantry. At 0600 hours, American scouts pushed toward the first ridgeline. They thought they had covered terrain, neutralized observation posts, and even had artillery prep. But from the farmhouse, the MG42 erupted. The rate of fire was staggering, a continuous blur, bullets hammering the earth around the advancing men. Those first rounds did not aim for a perfect hit. They aimed for volume and suppression. The German doctrine was clear: use the MG42 to shape the battlefield. By controlling the avenues of approach, the gunner dictated where the enemy moved, slowed, and paused. Each burst of fire covered the next section of the slope, forcing attackers into blind spots or predictable channels. The mountains amplified the sound. Each burst of the MG42 rolled through the valleys, echoing off cliffs and creating the perception of multiple weapons, even when only one gun was active. Barrel overheating was an ever-present concern. The MG42's quick-change barrel system allowed crews to swap barrels within 10 seconds, a skill honed through training and necessity. In the mountain positions, crews had to time these swaps carefully. Too early, and the enemy could exploit the pause. Too late, and the weapon risked damage or misfire. The assistant gunner's hands moved with precision, removing the scalding barrel, replacing it with a fresh one, and locking it in with a mechanical click that signaled readiness. By mid-morning, Allied troops had learned the truth of attacking prepared MG42 positions in the mountains. Every advance exacted a cost. The steep slopes, rocky ridges, and narrow roads amplified the MG42's lethality. It was not the volume alone that was decisive. It was the integration of terrain, fire discipline, and tactical placement. A single gun at a choke point could delay a platoon for hours, funneling them into other positions where additional MG42s waited. In contrast to the Pacific Theater, where American Marines leveraged the M2's penetrating power and versatility against fortified caves and bunkers, the MG42 in Italy excelled in area denial and suppression. The mountainous terrain was ideal for this approach. Elevation allowed German gunners to sight long corridors of fire, while natural obstacles forced attackers to bunch, creating dense targets. The MG42's high cyclic rate ensured that even brief exposure could be fatal. Yet the weapon was not flawless. Its extreme rate of fire, while terrifying, consumed ammunition rapidly. Logistics were critical. Each position required a continuous resupply of belts, otherwise the gun lost its psychological and tactical edge. German mountain supply units labored to bring rounds up narrow trails and precarious switchbacks, often under shelling or harassment. But the MG42 crews were trained to adapt, alternating fire among positions and timing bursts to conserve ammo while maintaining suppression. By afternoon, artillery barrages shifted to attempt neutralization of German positions. The MG42, with its stamped steel receiver and rugged construction, could withstand minor fragments and debris, but the crews themselves had to remain disciplined. One misplaced shot from artillery could silence the gun temporarily, but trained crews would relocate rapidly. Mobility, even in rugged terrain, was part of the doctrine. Crews rarely relied on a single emplacement indefinitely. Throughout the day, waves of Allied infantry attempted to ascend the ridges. Each assault met overlapping fields of MG42 fire. Casualties mounted, movement slowed, Every exposed soldier understood that these guns were not simple defensive tools, they were instruments of attrition, designed to exact a psychological as well as a physical toll. By controlling firepower, the Germans could shape the battlefield hours before any close combat engagement. The MG42's design reflected the Wehrmacht's broader philosophy. The weapon was a product of lessons learned in Poland, France, and North Africa. High-volume fire would suppress and dominate, allowing small units to achieve outsized tactical effects. Its lightweight construction, relative to earlier machine guns, enabled repositioning over difficult terrain. The rate of fire created a fear factor that slowed enemy assaults even when no one was hit. The sound alone conveyed inevitability, a relentless presence on the slopes. The German crews had drilled extensively before deployment. Rapid barrel changes, precise elevation adjustments, and coordination with neighboring emplacements were routine. Every squad understood mutual support. No MG42 operated in isolation. Each gun's field of fire overlapped another's, creating lethal triangles that attackers had to navigate. These overlapping kill zones were particularly effective in Italy's mountain warfare, where narrow gullies and ridges constrained movement. Despite the advantages, the MG42's extreme specialization also revealed limitations. While effective against infantry and light vehicles, it could not penetrate heavy fortifications or bunkers with the same effect as the American M2. In the mountains, where the Germans relied heavily on natural rock and prepared positions, the MG42 was sufficient. In the Pacific, against reinforced concrete or coral caves, an MG42 would have been inadequate. This distinction highlights a central principle. Weapons excel in their intended environments. As dusk fell, the MG42 crews conducted maintenance, routines. Barrels were inspected, tripods readjusted, and belts prepared for the next day's action. The soldiers themselves, hardened by months of mountain warfare, were acutely aware of the weapon's value. In capable hands, the MG42 could dominate an engagement. Mismanaged, it was merely a loud, high-consuming machine. Training, discipline, and tactical understanding amplified the weapon's potential exponentially. In the broader campaign, the MG42 earned its reputation. American intelligence, after analyzing after-action reports, noted its fearsome effectiveness in delaying Allied advances, inflicting casualties, and shaping the battlefield. In the mountains of Italy, it proved a force multiplier, a weapon that allowed fewer soldiers to achieve outsized defensive effects. Yet, even in this environment optimal for its design, the MG42 had inherent trade-offs. Its extremely high rate of fire demanded rapid resupply, constant barrel changes, and disciplined fire control. Crews could not rely on instinct alone. The gun's effectiveness depended on training and coordination. In contrast, the M2, slower but more versatile, required less exacting management in diverse combat situations, from ships to vehicles to entrenched bunkers. This comparison would become increasingly important in the post-war assessment of small arms effectiveness. The MG42 dominated a specific tactical environment, European hedgerows, mountain passes, and open plains, but its advantages were context-dependent. The M2 Browning, by comparison, delivered consistent lethality across multiple theatres, earning its designation as the weapon that won in versatility and long-term impact. As night fell over the Gothic line, the MG42 crews settled into a rhythm. Observation posts reported the last of the advancing Allied squads forced into cover. The sound of the guns faded to intermittent bursts, only to rise again at first light. For these men, the MG42 was not a mechanical marvel alone, it was a strategic partner, an extension of their doctrine, and the key to holding terrain against a numerically superior opponent. The mountains of Italy would witness many more engagements. Each ridge, each valley, each narrow road was a proving ground for the MG42 and its crews. Its legend grew with every engagement, every defensive success, and every pause in which attackers reconsidered their advance in the face of relentless fire. But history would eventually evaluate these weapons not in isolation, but in comparison across theatres, where the American M2 would emerge as the system capable of winning in a broader spectrum of combat environments. By the time the Allies breached the Gothic Line, the MG42 had proven its worth in its environment, devastating, precise in trained hands, and psychologically terrifying. Yet its triumph was contextual, and that context steep mountain passes, prepared positions, and interlocking fields of fire highlighted a central lesson of World War II small arms analysis. Effectiveness is environment-dependent. The MG42 would continue to inspire, influence, and dominate post-war machine gun design. Its stamped steel construction, barrel change system, and rate-of-fire principles became blueprints for the world's post-war automatic weapons. Yet, in comparing legacy and versatility, the M2 Browning would become the gun that could be deployed anywhere and achieve results regardless of terrain or theatre, a lesson reinforced as Allied planners studied Italy in 1944 and beyond. In the mountains, the MG42 reigned. It required discipline, it required supply, and it required soldiers who could think in terms of overlapping fields of fire. But it also proved a timeless truth. A weapon's effectiveness is inseparable from doctrine and training. Raw firepower alone does not dominate a battlefield. Its application, understanding, and integration with terrain do. And in Italy, 1944, the MG42 showed the world just how terrifyingly effective a machine gun could be when placed in the hands of trained, disciplined soldiers, defending the high ground against an advancing foe. By 1944, the Pacific Theatre had become a testing ground for the extremes of warfare. Dense jungles, coral atolls, volcanic ridges, and sprawling islands where traditional tactics often failed. In this environment, the M2 Browning heavy machine gun distinguished itself as the most adaptable automatic weapon in the American arsenal. Unlike the MG42, designed for high-volume fire in prepared, relatively stable positions, the M2 was a weapon of versatility, capable of being mounted on ground vehicles, naval craft, aircraft, and in fixed defensive positions with equal effectiveness. Its performance was not measured solely by rate of fire, but by survivability, reliability, and utility across multiple terrains and operational contexts. The first step in understanding the M2's Pacific dominance is logistics and deployment. The gun weighed approximately 84 pounds for the standard M2 HB variant, with barrels, tripod mounts, and associated gear adding additional weight. Yet, soldiers and Marines quickly learned that its portability was within human limits, particularly when broken down into components. Crews could transport the weapon over rough terrain, establish firing positions in under 15 minutes, and maintain continuous fire for extended periods, thanks to its air-cooled barrel and simple quick-change design. On the island of Peleliu, 1944, Marine units faced Japanese defenders entrenched in fortified caves and ridges. These positions rendered standard infantry rifles and even light machine guns largely ineffective. The M2, firing the powerful 50 BMG cartridge, could penetrate reinforced concrete, blast cave entrances, and suppress enemy positions from distances that kept operators relatively safe. One Marine recollection captured the essence of the weapon. A single gun on the ridge made a hole big enough to swallow a foxhole. Unlike the MG42, whose extreme cyclic rate of fire demanded continuous supply of ammunition and careful timing to prevent barrel overheating, the M2's 450-550 rounds per minute provided a balance between destructive power and sustainable operation. Crews could fire extended bursts without catastrophic barrel wear, especially when trained to rotate barrels and apply proper cooling intervals. The American emphasis on durability and sustained fire mirrored the challenges of the Pacific environment. Humidity, salt, sand, and intense heat made high-maintenance weapons impractical. The MG42, though formidable in Europe, would have faced extreme reliability issues if transported and operated across the jungles and coral atolls of the Pacific. The gun's adaptability extended to mounting platforms. In jungle warfare, the M2 could be tripod-mounted for defensive positions along narrow approaches or open fields. In amphibious operations, it served as a key component of naval gunfire support on landing craft, where its long-range fire could suppress enemy positions while troops stormed the beaches. Aircraft-mounted M2S on the B-25, Mitchell and P-38, Lightning provided strafing and defensive fire, giving pilots the ability to neutralize bunkers, light vehicles, and enemy personnel from the air. This cross-platform versatility was unmatched by any contemporary German weapon, whose design optimized it for infantry-centric, line-of-sight engagements rather than multi-domain operations. In addition to its physical adaptability, the M2's tactical employment reflected a doctrine emphasizing flexibility. Pacific campaigns often required rapid repositioning of fire support. A ridge might be assaulted in the morning and abandoned by night. Crews had to set up quickly, deliver maximum effect, and withdraw before counterattack. The Browning M2's simple mounting systems, paired with lightweight ammunition belts and modular construction, allowed Marines and soldiers to execute these maneuvers efficiently. This contrasted sharply with the MG42, which excelled in static positions, but required careful planning and preparation to relocate effectively, a disadvantage in a theatre defined by shifting front lines and isolated engagements. Training also played a critical role in the M2's success. American gunners underwent rigorous instruction, emphasizing target prioritization, range estimation, and rate of fire management. Unlike the German MG42 doctrine, which relied on interlocking fields of fire and suppression of advancing infantry, the Pacific M2 crews had to master precision over sheer volume in many situations. Penetrating a cave entrance or knocking out a Japanese pillbox required calculated bursts rather than a constant torrent of bullets. In jungle conditions, wasting ammunition could be fatal. Supply lines were fragile, and resupply often required small boats, aircraft drops, or long overland treks. On Peleliu, the M2 demonstrated this principle repeatedly. Marines established firing positions, overlooking narrow approach paths carved through coral ridges and undergrowth. From these emplacements, gunners could deliver devastating suppressive fire while conserving ammunition. The weapon's recoil was manageable even in improvised positions, allowing for sustained engagement without fatiguing the operator excessively. When Japanese soldiers attempted flanking maneuvers through the dense terrain, coordinated M2 fire covered likely avenues of approach, forcing attackers into exposed gaps where riflemen or mortars could engage them. Another defining characteristic of the M2 was its psychological effect. 50 caliber round created a distinct, unmistakable signature. Soldiers reported that hearing the M2's burst from a concealed position was enough to slow assaults, break morale, and compel caution. The combination of kinetic power, noise, and accuracy made the M2 a weapon that shaped the battlefield not only physically but psychologically. German troops in Europe experienced a similar effect from the MG42, but in the Pacific, the M2's reach across multiple combat domains, infantry, vehicle, naval, and air magnified this effect exponentially. One notable example of the M2's impact occurred during the Battle of Leyte, 1944. American forces advancing through thick jungle encountered entrenched Japanese positions on ridges overlooking key river crossings. Infantry assaults were repeatedly repelled, and casualties mounted. M2 gunners, operating from portable tripod positions on adjacent hills, delivered precise fire into enemy fortifications. Unlike machine guns firing indiscriminately into open fields, the M2's controlled bursts could neutralize bunkers, knock down tree canopies for concealment, and cover river crossings. Within hours, Japanese defensive cohesion broke, allowing infantry to advance with reduced losses. The weapon's versatility extended to vehicle-mounted configurations as well. On the back of jeeps, trucks, and amphibious vehicles, the M2 could deliver both suppressive and anti-vehicle fire. Its effectiveness against light armored vehicles, pillboxes, and field fortifications meant that combined arms operations could integrate the M2 seamlessly into infantry armor coordination. German MG42s, while potent in defensive hedgerows or prepared positions, were not as easily integrated into mobile cross-domain operations. The Americans' ability to adapt the Browning M2 to every tactical requirement underscored a key factor in its theater-wide effectiveness. Aircraft-mounted M2S also showcased the gun's flexibility. From strafing runs over jungle ridges to defensive fire on bombers and transport aircraft, pilots could rely on the M2 to engage targets ranging from soldiers to light vehicles. On B-25 seconds and B-17 seconds, the gun was mounted in waist, tail, and nose positions, providing overlapping coverage and redundancy. Here, again, the combination of trained gunners, modular design, and cross-platform applicability gave the Americans a distinct advantage. Unlike the MG42, which required crews and emplacements optimized for ground defense, the M2 could perform effectively in the air, on the ground, and at sea. Environmental resilience was another critical advantage. Pacific jungles presented extreme heat, humidity, salt air, and frequent rain conditions that could jam, rust, or misalign less robust weapons. The M2's engineering, largely unchanged since the 1,930 seconds, proved remarkably resistant to these challenges. Soldiers often reported the gun continued to fire reliably after prolonged exposure to rain, mud, and salt water. Field maintenance was straightforward. Crews could disassemble, clean, and reassemble the weapon quickly. By contrast, the MG42, with its tightly machined moving parts and high cyclic rate, was more vulnerable to fouling in environments far removed from the European theatre where it was optimized. As 1944 progressed into 1945, the M2's impact on operational planning became apparent. Commanders could rely on a relatively small number of weapons to provide consistent firepower across multiple domains, reducing the need for large artillery deployments or complex logistics chains in isolated islands. Forward operating bases often had only one or two M2S per sector, yet these guns could dominate approach routes, support infantry maneuvers, and integrate with naval and air operations. In terms of doctrine, the Americans emphasized adaptability and cross-training. Infantry gunners learned to operate M2S on tripods, vehicles, and in improvised positions. Aircraft gunners trained with the same weapon, understanding ballistics and engagement principles from above. This interoperability multiplied the weapon's effectiveness exponentially. Each gun was no longer confined to a single role. It was a platform capable of shaping engagements across a wide spectrum of combat scenarios. By the time the Okinawa campaign commenced in 1945, the M2 had solidified its reputation. Gunners on ridges, beaches, and airfields could suppress and destroy enemy positions with precision. The gun's reliability and adaptability allowed the United States to overcome numerically entrenched defenders, execute amphibious operations with minimal delays, and maintain a tempo of operations that would have been impossible relying solely on rifles or lighter machine guns. From a comparative perspective, the MG42's advantages, extreme cyclic rate, psychological impact, and interlocking defensive fields were highly effective in European hedgerows, mountains, and defensive lines. Yet, these advantages were context-dependent. The Pacific environment required a weapon capable of operating in multiple roles, in remote and challenging terrain, with minimal logistical burden. In this regard, the Browning M2 outperformed its German counterpart, not through raw speed or volume of to-the-patient fire, but through adaptability, durability, and sustained operational utility. By the end of the Pacific War, the Browning M2 had been employed in virtually every conceivable combat scenario, mounted on aircraft for strafing runs, on jeeps for mobile fire support, in defensive emplacements on ridges, and on ships during amphibious operations. Its versatility and reliability allowed the U.S. military to project firepower across vast distances and varied environments, an achievement that no single German weapon system, optimized for a narrower set of conditions, could match. In sum, the Pacific campaigns of 1944–45 demonstrated that rate of fire alone does not determine effectiveness. The MG42's 1,200 rounds per minute were terrifying in Europe, but its utility diminished outside its optimized environment. The Browning M2, firing 450–550 rounds per minute, combined power, versatility, and reliability in a way that made it the most effective heavy machine gun in the US arsenal. In mountains, jungles, beaches, and islands, it could be counted on to perform day after day, engagement after engagement. The lessons of the Pacific were clear. Firepower is not solely measured by bullets per minute, but by adaptability, durability, training, and integration with combined arms doctrine. The M2 exemplified these principles. Its success was a product of American engineering, tactical foresight, and rigorous training. It was a weapon designed not just to kill, but to survive, adapt, and dominate across the diverse, unpredictable theaters of global warfare. And in the end, the Browning M2's legacy was cemented. Across islands, jungles, and mountain ridges, the weapon proved that effective firepower is not only measured by its rate of fire, but by the breadth of its application, the resilience of its design, and the skill of those who wield it. Where the MG42 achieved brilliance in Europe, the M2 achieved global dominance, becoming a cornerstone of American military success in the Pacific and a standard for machine gun design for decades to come. By the spring of 1945, the two most iconic machine guns of World War II, the German MG42 and the American Browning M2, had each proven their worth, though in vastly different ways. Both weapons inspired fear, demanded respect, and transformed the tactics of the armies that wielded them. Yet, when viewed from a global perspective, their effectiveness was shaped less by technical specifications alone and more by context, doctrine, and adaptability. The MG42, often called Hitler's buzzsaw, gained a reputation in Europe that bordered on legendary. Its blistering 1,200 rounds per minute and distinctive staccato report created both a psychological and physical impact on Allied troops. Infantry advancing across open terrain or attempting to breach prepared German positions encountered interlocking fields of fire that forced them into cover, slowed attacks, and inflicted devastating casualties. The weapon's ability to suppress entire platoons simultaneously was unmatched, and when used in combination with Germany's defensive doctrine machine gun nests placed in mutually supporting positions, it became a force multiplier. But the MG42's brilliance was inherently theatre-dependent. European battlefields, particularly in France, Italy, and Germany, were characterized by defensive lines, fortified positions, and predictable approaches. Villages, hedgerows, and mountain passes offered ideal fields of fire, allowing MG42 crews to fully exploit the weapon's rapid rate of fire and interlocking coverage. Outside of these prepared environments, however, the MG42's advantages diminished. Its high cyclic rate demanded frequent barrel changes, extensive logistical support for ammunition, and crews trained specifically in its operation. Mobility was limited. Redeploying a machine gun along rugged or tropical terrain under fire was neither quick nor simple. In other words, while the MG42 could dominate a battlefield, its dominance required preparation, support, and terrain that favored defensive fire. The Browning M2, by contrast, demonstrated a different kind of supremacy, one built on versatility rather than sheer rate of fire. Firing 50 BMG rounds at 450–550 rounds per minute, the M2 was slower than the MG42, but this slower pace allowed for controlled, sustained bursts that conserved ammunition and reduced wear. More importantly, the M2 could function effectively across multiple platforms, mounted on tripods for ground defense, on jeeps and trucks for mobile fire support, on naval vessels for coastal defense, and on aircraft for strafing or bomber protection. This adaptability became a defining characteristic of the American approach to warfare in the Pacific theater. Island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific presented challenges that no European weapon had fully anticipated: dense jungles, volcanic ridges, coral atolls, and beaches, where defensive positions were irregular and unpredictable. Japanese defenders excelled at concealment, booby traps, and small unit tactics that negated the MG42's advantages. In this environment, a high rate of fire alone did not guarantee battlefield dominance. Instead, American forces relied on the Browning M2's combination of firepower, durability, and cross-domain adaptability. Crews could move the weapon quickly, establish firing positions on treacherous terrain, suppress enemy fortifications, and support infantry, armor, or amphibious assaults without requiring specialized terrain or extensive logistics. Another critical factor in the M2's success was training and doctrine. American gunners underwent rigorous instruction that emphasized precision, target prioritization, and adaptive firing techniques. Crews learned not only to engage enemy soldiers but also to neutralize fortifications, vehicles, and even low-flying aircraft. The MG42, by contrast, was optimized for defensive fire in prearranged fields, and while its operators were often well-trained, their doctrine was less adaptable to fluid, rapidly changing battlefields like those encountered in the Pacific. The contrast highlights an enduring military principle: a weapon is only as effective as the soldiers trained to use it in relevant conditions. When comparing battlefield outcomes, the differences become striking. On the European front, MG42 crews could achieve devastating results when deployed correctly. Casualties among advancing Allied troops were significant, and morale was impacted heavily by the weapon's distinctive sound and unrelenting fire. The M2, had it been deployed under these same conditions in smaller numbers, might have struggled to achieve comparable suppression in static defensive positions, primarily because its lower rate of fire could not saturate open fields as quickly. Yet, in the Pacific, the M2's strengths were unparalleled. Its ability to support infantry, advances, penetrate fortifications, operate in extreme climates, and integrate into combined arms operations allowed relatively small crews to achieve outsized effects against determined defenders. The comparative analysis of these two weapons highlights the principle that rate of fire is not the sole measure of effectiveness. The MG42's 1,200 rounds per minute could dominate a prepared battlefield, but it required specific conditions to do so. The Browning M2's lower rate of fire was offset by its reliability, flexibility, and cross-domain utility. In essence, the M2 won not because it could fire faster, but because it could adapt to virtually any battlefield, any environment, and any operational role. Technology alone does not determine victory. Human factors remain decisive. Both weapons required skilled operators, but the M2's design minimized barriers to effective use. It could be mastered by well-trained crews in a relatively short period, and its operation was intuitive enough that a soldier could maintain effective fire under stress, even in austere environments. The MG42, by contrast, demanded extensive coordination, discipline, and logistical support to maintain its peak effectiveness. When conditions deviated from the ideal, its advantages eroded quickly. The lessons from these comparative theatres extend beyond World War II. Modern military planners recognize that adaptability and integration often outweigh raw firepower. Weapons that can perform reliably across multiple platforms and environments, combined with operators trained in adaptive tactics, provide more strategic value than specialized tools designed for a single optimal scenario. The M2 Browning exemplifies this philosophy, a system whose success was built on versatility, reliability, and the capacity to empower soldiers across diverse combat contexts. Ultimately, both the MG42 and Browning M2 represent different approaches to firepower. The MG42 epitomizes specialized excellence, a weapon optimized to dominate a specific set of conditions through sheer speed and suppression. The Browning M2 represents generalized superiority, a weapon capable of performing adequately in nearly any situation, excelling not because it outpaces all others, but because it can be adapted to the widest range of challenges. The two weapons cannot be judged solely by mechanical specifications. They must be understood in context, as reflections of the doctrines, training, and theatres in which they were employed. In summation, the story of the MG42 and the Browning M2 is a story of context, adaptation, and human ingenuity. The MG42 terrified soldiers and shaped battles in Europe with unmatched intensity, yet it was limited by its specialization. The M2, slower and less intimidating in raw numbers, achieved broader strategic effectiveness by adapting to conditions ranging from the Pacific jungles to amphibious assaults and aerial support. The victory of the M2 was not merely in bullets fired, but in its ability to sustain operations, integrate with diverse tactics, and amplify the effectiveness of the soldiers who wielded it. In the final accounting of World War II, the MG42 remains a symbol of technical brilliance and tactical terror, a masterpiece of engineering optimized for European battlefields. The Browning M2, however, emerged as a symbol of versatility, reliability, and enduring utility, a weapon whose lessons in adaptability continue to influence military doctrine to this day. In the contest of global effectiveness across diverse theatres, the M2's ability to survive, dominate, and empower made it the truly decisive machine gun of the war.